Good evening, Team Krulak community, and Happy New Year to everybody. This is our first episode of Down the Rabbit Hole of the Russia-Ukraine War here in 2023. And as always, we're pleased to welcome back Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia subject matter expert. And as we were just talking about before we started recording, realized that somewhat optimistically, we had set the recurring calendar event for this series to December 31st, 2022. I think we hoped that we would not have to do anything into the new year, but obviously that's not the case. So we are here in 2023 and, keeping our fingers crossed that we will not be revisiting this in January of 2024. But there's a lot of time between today and then, and obviously a lot of potentially things that could shift on the battlefield even in just the next couple months, which is one of the things we'll talk about today. So Yuval, good evening. Happy New Year. Good to see you again. Welcome back. And let's just get right to it. And since we were having some network issues before, we got to hope that it lasts through this whole one. As we're sort of running through the list of things that have occurred since our last discussion here. And I think the biggest thing was just a few days after we recorded the last Down the Rabbit Hole was a pair of out-of-country visits by the Ukrainian leadership and Russian leadership. We had Putin went to go visit his friend Lukashenko in Minsk, not for the first time, but it was sort of, the timing was interesting because it was also right about the same time that President Zelensky, his first out-of-country visit since the war started, and that was over to the United States, where he met with President Biden privately, did a press conference, and then he in person for the first time addressed a joint session of Congress. And obviously he's had previous addresses virtually, via Zoom to Congress, but first time, again, this time in person, and also, again, his first out-of-country visit. And so maybe we can go through the sort of the competing messages that came out between those two visits, and maybe also explore a little bit what the sort of message was that in President Zelensky's first, external visit, Washington, D.C. is a lot farther away than some of his European neighbors, as well as, European neighbors, as well as some of the other contributors to both the military and financial support to the country. But he went to D.C. first. So, Yuval, if you want to sort of maybe take us through the main messages, maybe some of the implications of each of those visits.
Sure thing, and Happy New Year to you as well. So we also Zelensky to D.C., Putin to Minsk, and we'll get to it also in a moment. Dmitry Medvedev, one-time president of Russia, also went to Beijing. The big message that Zelensky was able to deliver is, one, he left his own country to go to the place that is spearheading the efforts to save his country from complete and utter destruction. And in that regard, you go basically to the friendliest faces that you can find. And in the Congress is perhaps the most polarized it's been since, I don't know, the 1830s or 40s or something, or, the pre-Civil War era. But except for basically a couple exceptions, most of Congress was pretty well united in terms of welcoming Zelensky to Washington. And it also makes a difference that Zelensky was able to, put forth his message, which is, we're doing the fighting for the defense of democracy, for the defense of Europe, for the defense of liberal values and of civilization. So we need all the help that we can get. That was the core message that he came to Washington to deliver. And in that, it also makes a difference that he can speak English. And as a professional entertainer before he was in politics, was able to put in a bit of humor, was able to sort of capture the pathos of the situation, and was able to make what is effectively a sales pitch for the continued support of Ukraine. So in all regards, the visit went well. No gaffes, from anyone. And to an extent, it seems that obviously we don't know what happens when the control of Congress changes hands in, I guess 2 weeks or so, or something like that. But at the minimum, there seems to be a bipartisan, even far more than that is support to Ukraine. And in the Senate, there's also pretty good bipartisan support for Ukraine. So that was basically like the objective of the trip. and the objective seems to have worked. We also know that in terms of the support to Ukraine, one of the things that we haven't seen, well, we can get to that in just a minute. We also note, as you noted, President Putin went to Minsk during that time, and he sent his former prime minister and one time keeper of the seat warm while he was term limited, Dmitry Medvedev, to Beijing. And I think that if Zelensky had gone to Washington and Putin had gone to Beijing, basically in the same time period, it would have been a lot more humiliating for Putin, because Putin, considers himself to be on par with China, with Xi Jinping. And if he had then, insulted, as he did, Zelensky for going to his main patron, for him to turn around and do the same would have not been a great look. So they sent Medvedev to Beijing, who got his photo opportunity, was able to leave the country, which Medvedev looked super pleased about for that time. But Putin himself went to Minsk, and in Minsk, he, as he's done throughout this entire conflict, pressed his ally slash subordinate, Alexander Lukashenko, to do more and to do something. Now, the Belarusians have, allowed Russians to train on their territory, and there are Russian troops on the territory of Belarus, and they've, amended their nuclear weapons law to permit the stationing of foreign nuclear weapons, i.e., Russian nuclear weapons, on their territory. But so far, Lukashenko, who's been in power since the mid 1990s, is a political survivor above all else, has not yet joined the actual fighting in Ukraine. The Russians, Belarus, are able to do far less. And it's quite clear that over the last number of years, where the bulk of the money within the Belarusian state has gone to has not been the military, designed for use in foreign conflicts, but on internal security services. And anything bad that would happen to Belarusian forces in the field, that would just essentially create problems that may not be manageable without the plausible threat of basically Russian intervention to support him, as what happened the last time, which I think was in the halcyon days of 2019, I believe.
Yeah, I
2019,
think that's correct.
2018.
Yeah.
So if he doesn't have that sort of support now, he's going to be less and less likely to join the fighting. And so that's basically what took us to the new year. And of course, the Russians then rang in the new year in Ukraine with further missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. Sorry. The news to report, however, over the last maybe 24 to 48 hours is that yesterday the Ukrainians were able to, or they claimed and were able to show that they were able to shoot down all 39 drones launched from Russia into Ukraine. So it shows that through the misfortune of experience, they are improving their air defense. And we also have a major attack. We don't yet know the casualty figures, but the Russian government immediately acknowledged 63 casualties. So it's certainly some multiple of that. And that was in the town of Makiivka in Donetsk Oblast, or Donetsk region. And this was where ostensibly several hundred mobilized soldiers, who seem to all be from the town of Saratov, which is otherwise, just interesting on a personal note, it is the sister city to Dallas, Texas. So I happen to have already known where it is from beforehand. But they took over basically a technical university there in Makiivka, put these guys there, several hundred, and given that it's a relatively small town, and not everyone who is in DNR, for example, is pro-Russian. There have been many reports of artillery spotters, people helping with the reconnaissance of the area. But in addition, it was likely that local sources were able to alert the Ukrainian side that there was a lot of activity in that town. It was going to the technical college. The Ukrainians were allegedly also able to note the higher density of cell phone usage in that area, of calls going back to Russia. And so in combination, it also appears that the Russians were storing ammunition and vehicles in the same spot as where their soldiers were sleeping. So the HIMARS came in, destroyed everything, and it appears, there are quite a few casualties. And that's basically, what we've had over the last couple of days. In recent episodes, we talked about, the winter fighting season, that, everything will be wet for a while, but once the weather starts to freeze, then the ground will obviously get harder, and the Ukrainians should be able to then essentially move a bit faster, given that the vehicles they have at their disposal. There has been, in a sense, bad for, like, let's say, the Ukrainian offensives, but also good in terms of hurting Russian export potential, is that there's been a massive heat wave, relatively speaking, across Europe. And the amount of, one, natural gas usage has been way down, but it also means that nothing in Europe more or less has frozen. So we're still in, thinking about the weather, we're still basically in autumn, even in the first week of January. That said, the forecast looks to start to dip, perhaps sometime in the next 7 to 10 days, and that's really where we are. Let's say last 10 days, and looking ahead to the next 10.
Yeah, and if there's a couple things, if I could, I wanted to throw in on some of that stuff is, I there were a number of, going back to President Zelensky's visit to Congress, there were a number of sort of notable moments, and like you said, his sort of long experience as a public persona, I think, really came through in his speaking style, as well as some of the, both the humor he tried to inject, as well as calling on, America's own historical experience. I recall that in sort of the preview notes to the speech, it was said that he was going to call parallels between, the American forces at Bastogne that were encircled and surrounded during the winter 1944, as sort of akin to, Ukraine's situation, where at that point sort of just sheer tenacity got the Americans through at Bastogne until they could be relieved. But then he also threw in what I thought was kind of a deep cut of the Battle of Saratoga in the American Revolution. And when he said that, I'm like, wow, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to have to look that one up, because it's not something that's necessarily in your sort of immediate historical consciousness, but it was a battle that was a turning point in the fortunes of the American forces, during the American Revolution. And so it's pretty clear that he was calling out some parallels between, like, this is their war of independence. They've seen themselves as a independent, distinct nation for a long time, but this is the military conflict that's really going to define them. So, that was an interesting point for him to throw in. And I also wanted to make a note, like at the very end, I think we sort of knew this was coming, because another interesting parallel between, Putin's visit outside the country and Zelensky's was that I think about 48 hours prior, Zelensky had been on the front lines in the town of Bakhmut, which we had talked about as a current pretty point of very intense fighting in the last episode, and has continued to be a point of intense fighting with really no significant gains or changes on the ground. But as we discussed in the last episode, that seems to be a point that Putin has chosen as something he wants, regardless of whether it has any military value or not in comparison to its location. But he wants it, to prove that his forces can take something. And but Zelensky visited that scene of very intense fighting. One, his personal presence there is in stark contrast to Putin, who has not ventured any closer to the sound of the guns than he has to. I think the closest he came was driving across the bridge, the Kirk Bridge, that had been blown up, just to prove that it was, fixed again. But, President Zelensky had gotten Ukrainian soldiers to sign that flag, which he then presented 48 hours later, to Congress as a, sort of a token of friendship. And when he did that, it's not something that necessarily an audience outside the United States would maybe make more of than, this is a very sort of personal gift. But when he did that, I sort of, JLo's personal opinion here, I don't know if those outside the United States fully appreciate the power, sort of the symbolic power of a flag that we know has been on the front lines, in the same way an American audience does, who've been through the last 20 something years of the global war on terror, which, oh, by the way, that officially ended on the last day of December as well. So I guess that's done with. That people fly or taking flags out, sort of outside the wires, we would say, and putting them in their combat vehicles. Or I know on my deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, we would constantly take folded up U.S. flags with us out on our missions. We didn't hang them, it wasn't flown to interfere with the workings of the aircraft, but it was in the aircraft as we were out flying those missions, and we brought them back. And then they would get sent back to, friends and families back at home. They'd be sent to organizations that sponsored care packages and other support of the troops. Is just sort of a very tangible, I like, you could say that this was there, like the places your support was going. This flag was out there, in our front lines, as it were, and being sent back. So I just wanted to dwell on that a little bit, because outside of an American audience, there's a deeper resonance there, in a flag coming right from the front lines, that I suspect an American audience immersed in the war on terror for 2 decades, it was impactful in a way that may not be apparent to other audiences. At least that was my sense when I saw him do that.
Yeah, no, it's the flags are not merely, mementos that they carry sort of the deeper symbolic meaning, and particularly for people in Congress who are fairly intimately like aware of what exactly was global war on terror, support for the military, all of these issues. At that time, I do not know how many people in the audience would have been able to speak at length about the Battle of Saratoga, but sort of like the general point was made clear. And in one of the things we've seen about Zelensky in terms of creating soft power and essentially creating different messages and messaging environments is the guy goes to places, just in one, and two, as you put it, he goes to places which are close to the front lines or have been recently liberated, knowing that in essence, the physical appearance of the leader can raise morale. And of course, there's been lots of discussion in social media about how when Zelensky does go to places that people report, their fathers, husbands, brothers, etc., on the front lines, that those soldiers do get that morale boost when they know the president has just come or the president's about to come. It makes them fight harder because they know that someone at the very top cares about them. And that is contrasting with Putin, who basically doesn't go to anywhere where there's even a hint of danger. And that core difference sort of indicates, Putin is willing to basically have as many casualties as is necessary in order to secure more land for Russia and therefore his legacy. Whereas Zelensky is hoping to bring the war to an end, and in terms of trying to save as much human life as he can. And that's been quite different. And we saw, particularly after, the Ukrainians were able to retake Kherson, is that the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, had not visited the Russian city of Kherson. And within 24, 48 hours of Kherson going back to the Ukrainian control, Ukrainian president Zelensky visited the Ukrainian city of Kherson. And that's the sort of thing of what, the eyewitness reports and, the captured communications from the front lines of the Russian soldiers show that they know that their leadership, from the officers all the way to the president, simply do not care about them. They don't care about human life in general, and they certainly don't care about the lives of the Russian soldiers. And that's something that, what we're seeing in terms of the Russian decisions, like where and when to mobilize like their soldiers, is that, we can talk about this in just a moment, but it doesn't seem, other than just putting as many warm bodies as possible on the front lines, to basically reduce the Ukrainian advances just by sheer mass and little else beyond that. And that's essentially like a core difference that we've seen basically from the beginning of the conflict. And as we're basically rounding towards the first anniversary of it, is something that is making a difference in the war fighting capabilities of both sides.
Yeah, and not to dwell too much longer on the sort of the difference of personal example, but I think I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do think the in-person visits to the front lines or recently liberated places, it's indicative, among other things, of, as you said, sort of just the different value systems at play. Because aside from the the morale boost or the poking a thumb in the eye of Putin for not going near these places that he says are his, it's simply the expectation of, or it's what you expect your leaders to do, right? Like demonstrating a certain minimal level of concern and commitment to show that you do have that level of concern and acknowledging what your troops are doing. And again, I don't want to make too many parallels, but it harkens back to, again, to the global war on terror eras where, you would have these, very highly secure, very hush hush, deeply, detailed, arranged visits by Presidents Bush or President Obama to visit troops in Iraq or Afghanistan. And now I'm not discounting, their level of sort of willingness to take on personal risk, because nobody is expecting the president of the United States to like jump into the trench on the very front lines, or like go on patrol in downtown Fallujah, right? There are too many other national security concerns, among other things, to put the president in that situation. But the point was, they went to those countries where they had committed troops, right, where the citizens that they had ordered to risk their lives and personal security for national security objectives. They went to go visit them in those countries to show that they acknowledge that the sacrifice their troops are doing. And even in very arranged circumstances, the point is they still went to those countries, right? And that is not a risk-free proposition, no matter how much security and secrecy you wrapped around it. They still went. They went to Iraq and Afghanistan, which were not safe countries to be in, on the best of days. Putin just doesn't, because he doesn't care about those signals. He doesn't care about that message.
And at the end of the day, that's, as you put it, you don't expect the president of any country to like pick up a gun and join the fighting, but you do expect that person to take responsibility, and taking responsibility is made manifest when those leaders go to those places and say, I have these national security objectives for the defense of our country. I'm sending you to do something. I am here in order to like look at you eye to eye, face to face, and take responsibility for that decision. And that, I've been studying Russia one way or another for the past 17 years. And one of the things that is sort of a through line, in terms of like studying Putin, is that this is a person who doesn't take responsibility. He only makes the decision once basically like they've gone through what are the things that haven't worked. But in terms of saying, I stand behind this, even in, we'll talk in a second about his recent speech, to the Defense Industry Board in Russia. His messaging over the past 10 months has been, everything is going according to plan. The only thing that we didn't account for was the extreme deviousness of NATO. We'd only budgeted for deviousness, but nothing of this extreme variety. That is basically a message that's very clear. I'm going to blame everybody else but myself. And in fact, at several points in the last speech, he says, nothing is our fault. Nothing is due to our policy. This was all forced on us. And you're thinking like, actually started like this particular phase of the fighting. February 24th, the fighting began. February 23rd, you gave a speech in which you said, we're going to take territories of the neighbors. And the days before, you had your entire like political security, and not really the military leadership, or at least the civilian military leadership, in a room where you embarrassed them one by one to join your conflict. And it's that not recognizing that responsibility matters, like leadership matters. It's always somebody else's fault. That sort of trickles on down all the way to the front lines.
Yeah, and there's probably some more concerning implications for that in the long term, as he gets, as the reality of the situation sort of keeps tumbling on him, when there's nobody left to blame essentially for reverses. So that'll be something to watch here, down in the coming weeks and months as well. I do want a couple more things, and then we'll get back to our sort of our regularly scheduled program here. But to the HIMARS strike today, just some of the things you were mentioning, as well as like I said, I woke up and our former Swedish visiting fellow was the one who'd sent it to me, and there's some interesting implications of it, which sort of in no particular order, but kind of tie back to a little bit of our talk of the learning or lack of learning across the Russian military. And And I think it's probably, again, an oversimplification to say that there was zero learning going on across the Russian military. Because for those troops who've been in contact on the front lines, especially around very intense fighting, you don't survive to the next day without sort of a basic level of learning and adaptation. So, but I think it probably is closer to the truth to say that the learning it's shared very unevenly across the forces. And I think this particular strike is an indication that that group of regional volunteers slash conscripts, they had not been passed any of the sort of the useful survival knowledge that units who've been fighting against the Ukrainians for months at this point have probably figured out just as a matter of self survival. And some of the things you mentioned, one, the density of electromagnetic signals, personal cell phones indicating a large concentration of troops. The troops who are still alive along the front lines against the Ukrainians probably figured out that that's that's something you don't do if you want to live to the next day. Is either cluster those signals or use open communications like that, unless absolutely necessary. Two, the building them right next to an ammunition store, it violates so many basic rules of sort of rudimentary military planning and organization. I kind of even don't know where to start on that one, because that's stuff that the Russians hadn't figured it out from all the ammo dumps that have been blown up by the Ukrainians up to this point. Like every ammunition storage point, you don't put them next to the barracks, right? You just don't, because that's incredibly stupid. But I think it's indicated that that message hadn't made it to this new group of troops, which indicates that whatever training preparation these volunteers or conscripts are getting, there's no continuity of knowledge to pass sort of those. There's no linkage to the more experienced grizzled grognards at this point to pass that information down, right? Because your grizzled grognards are, one, they're probably much closer to the front line, holding the line with the knowledge and experience they won to survive at this point. And two, you killed a lot of those guys in the initial wave of the invasion because they were squandered in piecemeal advances and attacks that were not properly coordinated or used combined arms to support. So that the basic institutional knowledge was killed in the initial wave because they were just thrown in assuming Kyiv would fall in 3 days. So I think it's kind of telling at this point in the war, almost a year into it, that the basics of you don't billet your troops next to ammunition has still not like funneled down, to the new wave of people that are bringing in there. And then last point, and this is sort of not really related to the rest, but I didn't know that they were all from the same town until you mentioned that right before we started recording. And it kind of made me, the first thing in my mind was like, this reminds me of like the PALS battalions from World War I, right? Where you enlist with all your buddies because it's, you get to go to war with your friends, and that potentially does buy you a higher initial unit cohesion because the people who are in your unit. So that sort of overcomes one of the initial hurdles of pulling brand new people off the streets, giving them weapons and basic training, sending them to the front. At least they sort of know each other. That's not an insignificant thing. But as you mentioned that, I'm doing the math here. Say the Russians are being relatively honest, and we're talking, high double digits for the killed, and let's do sort of times 3 wounded as sort of the normal calculus. That does make this one strike have casualty levels in the hundreds. And I'm not, extending any extra sympathy to, people who've invaded their neighbors, but for that one town in Russia, that's going to be a really bad day. Like when all that news comes back that they've lost potentially hundreds of their sons, brothers, towns, and they all know each other. These are not strangers. They're going to know probably every name that's on that list when it comes back. And it sort of makes you wonder, this is not the only sort of group of regional volunteers that have gone together. How many times outside of a very high profile mass casualty strike has this happened for these regional volunteer units? And are we, as we sort of mentioned much earlier in the series, Russia's going from a 21st century military to a 20th century military back to a 19th. Like this whole PALS battalion thing was like very early World War I, early 20th century. The aftershocks of that were pretty gut wrenching to the society because it wasn't just the British, right? Like I've done a little bit of touring and visiting in the French countryside, and every little French town has a list of names from World War One, a long list of people who didn't come back. So the loss of those people to that one community is going to be, it's going to be gut wrenching. And so just if this is sort of their approach to organization and getting troops to the front line, just this is sort of again Putin's attempting to win the next 2 weeks to the next news cycle and not really caring about the longer term implications. You're going to have all of these little Russian communities who are going to have sort of the prime of their youth, lost in these types of things because of how they've organized their military for short-term gain. There's going to be many longer-term after effects. The loss of a few hundred people in a Palace battalion is going to be one of them. It's going to resonate long after the war is over.
Yeah, just like the last thought that came up is it's probably that if these guys all knew each other because they're from the same town, it's probably they were all drafted by the same, like basically whatever precinct level of like the local military commissariat. And so it could quite literally be people who were conscripted together, basically organized together, trained together, and then moved closer to the front lines together. So it's quite possible that these people really do know each other, if not like, every person knows every other person, but it could be same neighborhood.
And again, not to dwell on it, but it's, World War One was not the first time, right? Like in the American Civil War, you had towns and states raising their own volunteer units, and the whole point was you went and you fought together. But all it would take is one bad miscalculation of a commander to put all those troops in the same place into a really, into some bad decision making, and now you've got that town or that state that is now bereft of, again, sort of, the flower of their youth. That has impacts long after the war. Anyway, so moving on, you talked a little bit about the speech of Putin to the Russian industrial group. If you want to expand on that a little bit, on some of the things anything else that was discussed there.
So certainly, in terms of thinking about, what's going to be the rest of the winter fighting season, what does 2023 hold in store? There has been quite a lot of, and so getting to Putin and the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, in just a second, there has been many rumors in recent weeks of another wave of mobilization. The first one got, 3 to 350,000 men, and it appears the drumbeat of another one is coming. So another 350,000 men is good part of like the Russian strategy, if not to sort of gain more ground. It's not that they're doing any better fighting, but to signal to both the Ukrainians and to the larger, alliance network supporting Ukraine that the Russians do have the manpower to effectively freeze the fighting where it is. So wouldn't it be better to go to the negotiating table now versus losing however many more on both sides? We also had and so part of that, so there's also a video that was released by the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Alexei Reznikov, in which he said, one, it's happening. Two, unlike the first mobilization, which went after people in smaller towns, more provincial setting, that the next one is coming to the cities, and that the border will be closed, soon enough. And obviously, this is meant to make Russian men of a certain age quite nervous. And so part of the discussion about mobilization in the recent speeches and public commentary by Putin, Shoigu, and others is that, one, the difficulties that were faced in the first mobilization, Sergei Shoigu, who has never met a problem that he's not been able to solve just by mere suggestion of having solved it, is he said all the problems that were identified in the first mobilization were solved on the go, and that he's been very proud of the administrative abilities of the Russian state and of the military commissariat system. One sort of little tidbit that was put into the speech is that the conscription age in Russia is going to be increased from the minimum age is from 18 to 21. And so if I could get the word salad out of the way, it means that in Russia, like when you turn 18, you're therefore liable to be conscripted. But if you pass that without being conscripted, you're basically home free after that year. What the change is coming that was released in that speech is that up to 21, you can be conscripted for the first time. And that conscription for those in the first time across all of Russia, the maximum age is going to be 30 years old. So this means all basically Russian men from 18 to 30 are at some point going to be liable for military service under the new status. Over the course of the conflict, that those who have the resources do leave, and this is only going to encourage them to do more. There are these new patriotic youth organizations that Shoigu said 1.25 million children and teenagers have already signed up for. And I imagine that anyone in Russia who doesn't want, their sons to get in this conflict are probably going to start thinking, maybe it's best if, our son doesn't even finish high school in Russia, but just get this person out of the country. That seems to be something that we, in terms of the structure of Russia over the next decade. And one of the interesting tidbits that was picked up, in preparation for this, is that just in the first mobilization, at first conscription, 1% of Russia's able-bodied formal workforce. One of the consequences of that is that there has been essentially an uptick in inflation in Russia, because if you remove 1% of the entire workforce, you need to then be able to offer higher wages to those who don't get conscripted. There have also been a change in tax rules for IT workers, basically making work from home taxed at a much higher rate. And obviously, this is not just like whatever sort of COVID situation, but they want to make people who are in Russia essentially go to a workplace so that they can be more accountable to the state, compared to, let's say, someone who works for a Russian company but is an IT worker and is actually in Armenia, Georgia, or points further afield. A lot more people are going to be leaving the country over the course of 2023. And as the ruble has weakened because there's much less in the way of export earnings, there is also clearly across all of Russia, like their version, the consumer price index has shown tremendous price increases over basically all goods at this point. So at the same time that, the leadership is saying everything is fine, a lot of economic data is saying that it's not. And even in Putin's portion of the speech, he said that the first important thing that he said was there's no constraints in funding. That means obviously the defense industry can do whatever it wants, but there's also probably going to be a lot more wastage of money because there's no next year for Putin, or thinking about 5 years or 10 years from now. All the resources of Russia are going to be put into this conflict and doing as well as possible as soon as possible. That's just a recipe for inefficiency, graft, corruption, etc. He also noted that the two most important things, and obviously a signal to those listening, is that drones must improve basically like immediately, so that basically Russian soldiers are able to get the information they need in order to do, to have targeting information as quickly as possible. So basically, that also shows the Russian ability to have, the recon strike complex has not been as basically well performed or well implemented as perhaps many had been fearing over the last couple of years. And he also noted that the basic kit, food, dry rations, protective equipment, uniform, boots, helmets, things of that nature, is in an insufficient state relative for maintaining the special military operation for an indefinite period. He did give a shout out to the population of Russia for crowdfunding, those things that the soldiers need. But it shows that there are lots of issues happening within the Russian, defense industrial complex. They don't have the things, they don't have microchips, so they can't make drones. So they need to get it from like Iran or North Korea or other places. And it's simply, even with whatever they've been able to buy over the past year, it hasn't been enough. They also show that those in the fighting don't have everything they need in order to fight. And that, going back to how much does Putin care about the individual soldier? Obviously not very much. And we're now 10 months into a conflict in which all the things that the soldiers need to fight are still not getting to them. And that's really, like, when we think about the logistical and the production difficulties that Russia's been basically demonstrating over the past 10 months, it's not immediately obvious that this stuff is going to improve, and for basically stuff to get to the front lines quicker so that people can survive and pass on the institutional knowledge of how to survive and how to fight, as you mentioned like a little while ago. And so in that regard, what we've seen Russia do as basically a way to mitigate this issue is just put as many people on the front line as possible, and to use mass as the speed bump for basically the Ukrainian forces on the other side.
That sort of hits on a couple of interesting points that we've hit previously as well. One is, the Ukrainian government is obviously, they've gone the crowdsourcing approach as well, right? There's I think it's Ukraine, or no, it's United 24, I think, is sort of the official like federal Ukrainian approach. But there's also been a number of smaller Ukrainian nonprofits, non-government organizations, as well as international nonprofits, NGOs, who have done various crowdfunding things for the Ukrainian military, Ukrainian populace. But the big difference is Ukraine did not expect this war, right? Whereas Russia planned for it. And the fact that they're now at this point with a pre-planned, deliberate war that they undertook with months and months of preparation and stockpiling, that they are crowdsourcing basic stuff like uniforms. It sort of goes back to the overall level of dysfunction and corruption that permeates the Russian military structure, civil structure, and which, by the way, we mentioned before, like Putin has encouraged this, right? This is all downstream of the type of overarching autocracy special to him that he's done. This is all part of the plan, essentially. But it's still striking that 10 months in, come winter, cold weather clothing. Actually, this is the second winter, right? Cold weather clothing and things like that, basic stuff, still a problem for the Russian military when they pre-planned, or at least he pre-planned this war for a long time. And then the drone thing as well, I only bring it up because our former Swedish visiting fellow, Henrik Paulson, he sent me a bunch of texts this morning. One was about the HIMARS strike, but another was admittedly, it was an undated video, but it was of a Ukrainian drone. So one, Russia is importing drones from other countries. Meanwhile, the video he sent me was of a 3D printed drone using commercially available parts and then armed with a RKG-3 EFP grenade as the warhead. And one of these was used to fly directly into a trench line to deliver its munition, while a second one was there acting as the spotter, basically watching this one go in. And again, it's just a contrast of, Russia's importing stuff while Ukraine is using, again, 21st century technology, additive manufacturing, to combine existing munitions with innovative uses of additive manufacturing to create new things for themselves, to be used in new and interesting ways. But the other thing from the video, and this goes back to like the learning organization, and I mentioned this to Henrik, which is, again, admittedly the video is undated, but sort of the spotter drone watching the munition fly in, the trench line itself is completely unconcealed and uncamouflaged from an aerial perspective. It is this giant scar of dirt in the ground with upturned earth basically sort of thrown out on either side. And the point is, you can tell it's a trench. You can tell it's a trench from far, far away. And it's just striking, again, that at this point in the conflict where Ukrainian precision fires, along with UAS-enabled precision fires and, sort of kamikaze mini munitions, we are almost a year into this, and there are still places on the battlefield where the Russian forces are not taking basic cover and concealment precautions from the air. Because from 100 feet or 200 feet, you can tell where recently upturned earth is. It's very obvious on a sensor. And the fact that they are still not taking any measure to sort of camouflage their trenches from above is, again, it's indicative that where learning may be occurring in some places, but it is not translating uniformly across the force, it makes every attempt for that Russian soldier to survive on the battlefield harder, because it's the same thing as, like, you don't put ammunition next to the barracks. You should cover and conceal a trench that you have recently dug, because from more than 5 feet away, and especially from above, it is blindingly obvious that that is a man-made fortification there. And if it's a man-made fortification, there might be something there worth targeting. We're a year into this almost, and those lessons are still not percolating across the force. Again, to tie it back to the whole, this is the house that Putin built kind of thing. He doesn't want an adaptive and innovative force, because that kind of force can ask questions, questions about the whole system that put them there in the first place. So I guess it's better to sacrifice a few dozen or 100 Russian soldiers in unprotected, uncamouflaged trenches than make any meaningful changes that would increase their survivability, but then maybe also raise some questions about why they're there in the first place.
Yeah, and just to, one little tidbits that came up, in the end of the year news dump, um, Putin also canceled his annual call-in show, is not going to have his constitutionally mandated address to the Federal Assembly, is not going to have, really any interactions with unscreened people. Is there was a decree that the requirement that bureaucrats in Russia clear their, and it's worth dwelling on for a moment because this is a very clear trade, and obviously, like, also sort of evidence of like the weakness of Putin within the political system is that if he's telling people you don't, as long as I'm in charge, you don't need to declare your income, that's effectively a trade. I will permit graft, corruption, theft of state resources, even during the time of conflict. I just need you not to think any big thoughts thereafter. That'll obviously be a trade that many will take because they'll take this opportunity at the time that, the Russian military economy, the Russian military like manufacturing base needs to, in fact, get better, more efficient, more innovative. It'll go in the opposite direction because why wouldn't you steal? Because ostensibly, if you know that Putin is allowing you to take whatever it is that you can get right now, he's not thinking about next year or 2 years from now. He's thinking about today. So as long as you can just keep things going where you're stealing everything from, out the back of the truck, then you're going to take that. And what this will do over the obviously the next months, years, etc., is that it will hollow out Russian governance even further. And eventually there's going to be just like much less stuff to take or to steal. And at that point, things that we've seen in times of turbulence in Russia before, which is if I'm stealing something and the other person's stealing something, I'm going to be much more concerned about basically my rival rather than thinking about the public interest, rather than thinking about Putin. I'm either going to think I'd like to take him out because I want his stuff, or I assume that he wants to do the same to me. So therefore, I'm going to strike first so he doesn't have a chance to clean me out before. And the combination is we're going to see much more violence and basically like consolidation of power at these lower levels than there were before, because people are going to take this opportunity to take as much as possible. And once they start taking, no one wants to be the last one left not to take. And that, in effect, is going to be, something that we'll see over the course of this year, far more violence, basically within the power structures, within the security services, of people not wanting to be left out when the spoils are being divided. And once basically the music over, it's going to be very difficult for Putin to then motivate that same democracy to do his bidding. And in times before, we've seen what do leaders do in this situation? They have to use much more coercion. Coercion against the bureaucrats, coercion against the public. How long does that last? We could go on. The consequence of not being a learning organization, the consequence of not getting better, is that you need to find different ways to motivate people. And if you motivate them through permitting corruption, or you motivate them through fear of coercion, the beatings will continue until morale improves. It only goes for a little bit amount of time before you need to essentially keep going at it, allow them to steal more, crack heads even further, and eventually it all runs out. And Putin is no different from any other autocratic leader. He's pretty secure now, but once the power starts to waver, it'll crack very quickly.
Yeah, and again, as you were sort of talking through that, the whole learning or lack of learning was running through my head again, and I think it's his decision to do this. It kind of maybe it answers a question he's not asking himself, but maybe that others are asking outside of Russia, which is what is their capacity to learn and adapt their system to win what they are characterizing as an existential struggle. And his decision to do this is essentially, it sort of reads as a doubling down on the same corrupt sort of closed loop system that he has spent his entire career building. So if the question is, are they able to make like large, significant cultural changes and adaptations to win this existential crisis? That would seem to indicate he's not ready to do that yet. Which raises the second question further down the road: is he willing to do that ever? or is he even capable of conceiving that, or is his lack of willingness to adapt his culture that he's built that's enabled him to stay in power to the crisis? If he's not able to do that, then it's really just a matter of time, before he runs out of weeks that he can punt the can down the road, before the whole thing sort of comes collapsing in. But unfortunately, the problem is that there can still be a lot of destruction and chaos and very bad things happening before that point comes. So anyway, but no, it's interesting that he does seem to be sort of doubling down on the system that he built, because he's not willing to lose that system. That seems to be the priority. All right. Well, I think we've been going, even despite our technical difficulties, for about an hour now. So any final thoughts to put out before we wrap up?
We said this when we started the series. Hopefully we'll be done soon. Although I really enjoy your company, I hope we're not doing this next year.
I think it's fair to say that we will be doing episodes on the 1-year anniversary of the invasion, unfortunately. But, fingers crossed that, as we've said in past episodes, as well as not on camera, things can change very quickly on the battlefield. And looking at today to the 1-year anniversary of the war, in just under 2 months from now, as the weather changes and gets colder, that creates potentially new dynamics on the battlefield. A lot can happen in 2 months. So probably still a fair guess we'll be here in February, late February, but it would be nice if we were not here this time next year. Anyway, yes, it is always good to see you, Yuval. So again, first episode here in the new year. Yeah, first episode in the new year. I guess that's all we can say about that. We'll continue to look at this as the weeks and months go by, and just hoping that it's sooner rather than later that we can end this.
Right on. Be well.
You as well. Take care. Bye.